Technicians of Spaceship Earth, welcome to Hawkbinge, your guide to the astral plane that is the Hawkwind discography, one album at a time, in the company of a long-term fan, which is me, and our first-time listener, which is Matt. How are you doing, Matt? Welcome back.
Thank you very much, and welcome back to you as well, Andy. It's been a little bit of a time away, unfortunately. This is episode 13, actually, by my calculation. Unlucky for some, especially for anyone who is expecting a timely follow-up from Sonic Attack.
Exactly. We kind of intended to give ourselves a 2 or 3 week break that became 3 months due to assorted work nightmares, travel, and various illnesses.
It unfortunately became a little bit of a multi-car pile-up of events, didn't it? But we are here now, and we did at least give people something to chew on in terms of the Sonic Attack off, which we'll get to later on. So in terms of people who only listen to the podcast, sorry, it's been a little bit of a gap. But to anyone who enjoys the extra content, thank you very much for everyone who pitched in and lent their opinions to what became the Sonic Attack of the Hawkbinge podcast and everything else that came along with it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was really, really good. And now we're back on the horse. We are definitely aiming to get to Choose Your Masks quickly after we finish up here, partly because we've now been listening to Church of Hawkwind for about 3 months, which is longer than we've ever been listening to any other Hawkwind album for. And with that, we have also been listening to other things in that 3 months. Otherwise, I'm not sure how many shreds of sanity would remain. I'm sure there's 1 or 2 things that you would like to talk about in that time.
There are 1 or 2 things. There are 2 things, which we normally do, so that keeps us very much in theme. The 2 turntable picks I have for you today, Andy, are 2 things that I saw live. 2 quite different things that I went and saw. The first one is that I was able to see Mary Lattimore play at the Bowery Ballroom in Manhattan. Mary Lattimore is a really interesting artist. She is a harpist, and she plays pretty much by herself with a harp and various guitar pedals, one of them being a looper and one of them being some kind of pitched delay, which means that she'll start to play something, she'll loop it, and then she'll play over it and over it and over it. So what begins as a very simple theme slowly grows in intensity until eventually she stops and just lets it all dissolve out. It was quite spellbinding. You don't really see a harpist, especially a technologically enabled one. The album is called Silver Ladders, and to be honest, I could have put this album into a turntable pick at any time when we've been doing Hawkbinge because it actually came out in 2020. It's semi-made in COVID, so it has this very somber, very enclosed feeling, where before a lot of her work was very bright and sparkly. This one was a lot more moody, so I guess it called to me. I do like the undulation and the repetition and just the fact that more and more stuff happens with every track. It's very engrossing. And to see her live, it's amazing to see how accurate the album is to what she does. It's that seamless and that well done. There's sometimes a little cello or a synth that just adds to the feeling of space that she works with, but generally it is just one lady playing essentially 10 or 12 harps once you've looped enough of it. But yeah, super atmospheric, super great. The track which I'm going to share is called Till a Mermaid Drags You Under, and that is on Silver Ladders by Mary Lattimore. It's on Ghostly International, which is an amazing record label, one of my favourites. And I think I started listening to the record definitely just because it was on Ghostly. And from pretty much the first pluck of the string on the first track, I was engrossed. And then whenever I put it on, I just slip into it. And by the end of the album, I feel like I've definitely been processed atmospherically.
Outstanding. I'm definitely down for checking out some, was it Mary Lattimore?
Mary Lattimore, yes.
Mary Lattimore. That sounds amazing. Love a bunch of effects on something that doesn't look like it's supposed to have any effects applied to it. Well, for me, again, in all of that time, there's been so much music under the bridge. Obviously, we did Desert Fest in New York, which was fantastic. I did Desert Fest in London as well. So there's more new bands than I can shake a stick at. But that now feels like ancient history. I very nearly went with the Sex Pistols album, having watched Pistol.
Oh, I've not seen that yet.
It's good fun. You know, as with all of these things, it's kind of made palatable for the public. It's quite nice and sanitized, I think. But, you know, it's good fun. But it does make you listen to the album and realize just what an album that is. And we talked a little bit about punk, of course, because of the influence and the role that Hawkwind had on it. And I did listen to the album for a while, but it took me to a favourite album of mine by The Damned called Machine Gun Etiquette, which is their third album. They did 2 albums, then they kind of split up for a bit and they came back and they did Machine Gun Etiquette in 1979. It's a brilliant album. It's a little bit more musical than they'd done before. It has some great tracks on it, such as Plan 9, Channel 7, and Just Can't Be Happy Today, Love Song, and the track that I've chosen for the playlist, which is Smash It Up, Parts 1 and 2. It's one of those albums I can play at pretty much any time and just immediately get into it. So The Damned make an appearance here in their slightly pre-goth. They went full goth slightly down the line. Lemmy, of course, played with The Damned on tour once or twice, so tiny bit of a crossover there.
That's cool. I have not listened to The Damned in a long time, so it'd be nice to have that on the playlist, and a very different vibe to what I just put out. So again, our playlist will continue to be absolute chaos as it should be. As you spoke about Desert Fest, actually, my second pick is a Desert Fest New York band that we discovered together. Not being able to get to Desert Fest London has always been a bane of me being in America right now. So you coming over was really nice. It kept that tradition alive. And there were a lot of bands that we had not seen. You know, there were a couple of sure hits like Big Business and Telekinetic Yeti, who were always guaranteed to bring the house down. But there was a little room in the Knockdown Center which had some of the lesser known artists in it, which was great. And one of those that I really enjoyed was the band called Brume, spelled Brume. I guess I could have picked a lot of bands because there was a lot of cool stuff that we checked out, but that band called out to me just because of the amount of fun they seemed to be having on stage. You know, it really felt like they really wanted to be there, which was great considering the stage was tiny and the vibe was very intense. So for them to come out and just feel like they'd made it was very infectious. They're a 3-piece and they really wear their influences on their sleeve by combining big Sabbathy riffs mixed with much more like chilled Portishead vocals. The singer came out with dyed ocean green hair and was wearing what looked like some kind of lacy wedding dress over some jeans and boots. So it was quite a visual theme, which was cool. And just proceeded to rock out for like 45 minutes. And that really made me feel like Desert Fest was back and we'd arrived. So I really liked that and wanted to share that with everyone. The track on their most recent album called Rabbits is a track called Scurry, and that's on Magnetic Eye Records. I think it combines some of the best bits I like with them, some driving rhythms, some good, like I said, like Sabbathy riffs, but again, that much more glassy, haunted vocals over the top, which obviously like Ozzy isn't going to give you.
And they had the cellist on stage, didn't they?
Mm-hmm. Like a kind of electronic cello. Yeah,
yes.
That kind of looked like the skeletal remains of a hollowed out cello.
That's right. That's right.
And she was able to bow that thing to get that sinister, almost Westworld charm. But like you said, would also throw her hair around and shout with the best of them. Yeah,
they were amazing. And there was some really nice experimental stuff, I thought. We saw a theremin, didn't we, with one of the bands? Mm-hmm. And one band who were playing as heavy as anything had a double bass, which I've not seen before. But yeah, you're right. Brume were very, very good. And Magnetic Eye, great label, actually. There's a lot of really good bands that would appeal to a lot of people, I think, who listen to this on Magnetic Eye. I think Giobia is on Magnetic Eye, which was a bit of a favourite with people when we had them on the playlist. Well, that's pretty good. That is pretty good. I was tempted to go down the Desert Fest route, but in the end did not. Partly because I then subsequently moved heavily back into a little King Crimson deep dive, which I do fairly often. They are definitely one of the bigger bands for me over many, many years, and have many different phases and many different lineups and do lots of different types of music. So it's a band I think is going to come back several times from different eras, I suspect. But in this case, it was the 80s quartet of King Crimson that I was listening to when they were definitely stripped back, kind of leading off from Fripp's time in New York and that kind of New York new wave scene. And it's the 1984 album 3 of a Perfect Pair, which is on EG and is probably the patchiest perhaps of their 3 80s albums. The huge album, the colossus of their 80s albums, is an album called Discipline, which is the first one they did in that lineup. But sometimes the one that is the big famous one isn't necessarily the one you go back to all the time, if you know what I mean. You go to something slightly different, and 3 of a Perfect Pair is the one I go back to the most. It has some amazing songs on it, but also has some of the weirder, more abstract stuff of King Crimson at that time. Sleepless is the track, which was an unexpected club hit for them with its remix. So that is one to check out. So that's a pretty eclectic set of 4.
Yeah, I'm happy with that.
Yep, not bad at all. Excellent. Before we go anywhere else, we've got a bit of a quick dive into the post bag, Matt.
Yes, Andy, this is going to be a quick dive, as you said, just because we've been away for so long. We've accrued a lot of messages and we don't want to turn this into a super huge podcast. So I'm just going to take care of a couple of things that happened on YouTube, which is slowly and steadily growing, much to my satisfaction. I think we are almost 190 subscribers strong, which is awesome. If you do like an audiovisual version of the podcast, then do make sure you subscribe. I do enjoy putting that together for everyone. And we've had some new people subscribe, so I would like to take this opportunity to say hello to Brett Hall, Chubidoo, Ed Wiener, Steve Little, and someone called Kat Pers, who added a comment saying, "OMG, I'm glad I finally found this place." So we're very happy that you're here. Brett Hall also left us a message on our Astounding Sounds episode saying that Steppenwolf is a novel by Hermann Hesse, who is a German-Swiss writer. It's essentially a story about a very conservative man called Max von Sydow, who is a writer visiting the steppes, who meets a woman and falls in love. She takes him on a journey which involves psychoactive activities, as he says. And then the man-wolf-wolf-man duality is about his struggles with his liberation from his rigidity, both emotionally and sexually. And the duality struggle is a big aspect of the book. And so the idea of him actually turning into a wolf is not correct. It's more about the idea of a wolf-like savage beast compared to the much more pared-down human that he's been before. So an interesting revelation into the genus of that.
Indeed, that track will never seem quite the same again.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because the lyrics they have make it feel much more like he is a man-wolf. Because, you know, he talks about, like, you know, having hairs on the back of his neck and having, like, animal senses and things. So I'm wondering whether or not they took the spirit of it rather than the letter of it in terms of their interpretation. But still, I like the idea of the Magic Theatre being an actual whole thing. This Max von Sydow goes down.
Yeah, very much so.
Also, one last thing, Andy, which I wanted to bring up, which hopefully doesn't end with me saying this and may go on to something more interesting from our podcast, is that someone called Pasco Brock commented on our Sonic Attack episode. And this is when I get massively frustrated by what I think is a glitch on YouTube, in that I can see the preview of what he says, but can't read the whole thing. So he says, "I have shared this on my Facebook page, Hawkwind Music and Times. What a great podcast for fans, loving the way you have spent time looking into the music. And one day I hope Hawkwind ... I don't know what he hopes, because I can't expand the message for some reason. I can't make it work. So I've joined the Hawkwind Music and Times group, and we'll definitely link that down to anyone who wants to check that out. But as far as I know, Pasco Brock is Dave Brock's son.
Pasco, if you're out there, tell us what follows the ...
Yes, please follow up. And thanks so much for reaching out. And I hope from what I'm reading that you like what we're doing and aren't massively offended by it. So thanks for dropping in. And it'd be great to talk to you. If you're around and listening, please do reach out and we shall do the same thing. But I thought that was an amazing thing to have happen. That happened about a week ago. So fun times.
Excellent. It would normally be my job as the holder of the keys to Twitter to have had a few interesting tweets. But to be honest, the prospect of going through 3 months of our Twitter feed is truly terrifying. So I haven't done it, but there will be a few when we get to the Choose Your Masks episode. I'll be back on board, because hopefully there will be significantly less than 3 months of that feed to go through. But thank you to everyone who keeps in touch. It's incredibly meaningful to us both, particularly actually when there's this huge hiatus, but the conversation keeps going. Which brings us to the Hawkbinge Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament. Because before we get all churchy on you, we just want to recap this significant event in Hawkbinge history. Thanks to everybody who voted, everyone who was gutted that their favourite was paired up with something by Bob Calvert, which meant it inevitably lost, or that somehow the novelty versions of Sonic Attack ended up drawn together. Who'd have thought? And thanks to everyone who voted for William Shatner. He's very grateful. And we just wanted to recap this, but we wanted to recap this in the company of the person who actually kicked this off with a Facebook post many, many months ago. So we had about a 20-minute chat with the one and only Bryan Pitkin. And before we get into Church of Hawkwind, we just wanted to recap the Hawkbinge Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament with Matt and Bryan and me. And on that note, introducing to Hawkbinge, the one and only Bryan Pitkin. Welcome aboard, Bryan.
Welcome.
Hi, how you doing?
Brilliant, excellent. And yes, you are responsible for the Hawkbinge Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament. But first, I think it would be good to know, given this is your first time on Hawkbinge, and there may be some people who don't know of your behemoth of a Facebook group. What is your background in Hawkwind appreciation and the beginning of that massive group?
I have been listening to Hawkwind since the late 80s. It's something I fell into, like most people, looking up Lemmy's old band. As far as the group goes, it's the Hawkwind and related album history group is something that kind of fell into my lap a few years ago, and I have used it as a space to track down the history of Hawkwind and kind of organize the bootlegs that I have in my closet.
Fantastic. And it's a great group. Definitely encourage people to check it out. Other friends of the pod, Joe Banks is also part of that group. And the group did become the exclusive Facebook home of the Hawkbinge Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament. And that's very fitting because you did very much inspire it. Do you remember the post that you wrote that led to all of this, Bryan?
I do. I was feeling bad for Matt when you threatened him to listen to all the various versions, and I decided to count. I came up with 15 live, 4 remixes, 5 studios, and 1 outtake that Hawkwind put out, not counting things that Alan did, that Niall did, that Nick did. That's 25 pummeling versions of Sonic Attack.
It's an extraordinary track for the number of different reinterpretations.
Yeah, well, I found it interesting that Matt didn't seem to get it, whereas for me, it's kind of quintessential Hawkwind. It has everything that I'm looking for in a Hawkwind song. You have the spoken word, the chaotic noise. Sometimes it's music, sometimes it's not.
Yeah, Matt, do you remember that word? So Bryan's post was following the bonus episode that we did for Space Ritual, the classic live album where this makes its first appearance. That was where I made the threat that you would have to listen to all of the versions and you hadn't really got it. Now you've listened to so many versions of it. Do you remember that first time?
I do. I remember it, like I said at the start, that it seemed to come out of nowhere and was very different to everything else. I think you're right that it does fit really nicely into that album because the whole thing is more of an art performance than a gig that I was expecting. And I think given that it's so soon in what Hawkwind does, and I still didn't really know what the band was or was capable of doing, for that to come out of nowhere was always a surprise. And I do feel that I'm of the age where I could still get the reference. It would be really interesting to play this now to, like a 14-year-old or something and see if they can try and figure out what the context around it is. Or would it just be a very strange stream of consciousness at that point? But I do remember being pretty perplexed by it. And in a way, still am slightly. I was very surprised how many times it's been covered. I'm sure we'll get around to talking to this, but it's interesting that after listening to all the remixes, I have a better appreciation of the original. I had to go through all of it in order to kind of get back to where it started with a new appreciation. It was almost that hero's journey kind of thing where, like I went on a journey and I met adversity and I overcame it and I came back to where I was, but different. And so I feel like, I have a new appreciation for it. But yes, I think my relationship with Sonic Attack is always going to be never as close as it is with a lot of other people's. And it's great that they have a track which is the quote unquote hit, which isn't Silver Machine. And it's very appropriate, probably, that something as strange as Sonic Attack is the one which people love. But I don't think I will ever get it. I think I get it more, but I don't think I'll ever be able to say I 100% understand that record in any of its multitude of permutations.
Well, there'll be more versions, I'm sure. You'll get one day. We'll play it at your funeral, Matt. Bryan, for Matt, the first version that he heard was the first time that anybody heard it was on that Space Ritual album, because Matt's obviously following the journey of someone who would have picked up each album as it came out. For me, like you, I got into Hawkwind in the 80s, and in fact the title track of the Sonic Attack album was the first one that I heard, and still is probably my favourite version of it. Which one did you come to first?
I came to the Space Ritual version. That is the earliest recorded version that they've ever released. There are a number of times where they played it with Mike Moorcock before that, but none of those have ever been recorded or ever heard. So starting at ground zero.
And isn't that sad that there's no good Moorcock version anywhere?
Well, he has stated that he's never been happy with any version that he's done, but the best that he did were in the early days of Hawkwind.
Fair. And of course, the eventual winner was that original version from Space Ritual, which I think comes as no surprise. It pretty much destroyed all that came before it. But there were some surprises along the way in that tournament. Were there any that caught you by surprise there, Bryan?
I really was rooting for Nick's 1999 party to get farther into the competition. I was really hoping that it would get farther, but he was knocked out by Bob really early in the race.
Bob actually only ever lost to Bob in this tournament. But Ambient Anarchist was something of a surprise for me in terms of the success it had and the appreciation it got.
It was interesting to see that your different platforms that you did your quiz on had different results. I mean, it was not the same on Twitter as it was on Instagram as it was on Facebook.
Yeah, that is really interesting. It suggests different types of people. I don't know whether different generations. It's really hard to quantify. But there were certainly some matches where there was a reasonable margin of victory on one platform and almost the same margin of victory for the other one on a different platform. And in those cases, Instagram ended up being like the tiebreaker. It was certainly the one that had fewer responses, but those responses certainly made the result in several matches. In particular, that Ambient Anarchist version of Bob's versus the version of Nick's that you loved and a lot of people loved and wanted to go through was a time was up, next vote in was going to be decider, and it came on Insta and it was for Bob. So yeah, I didn't see that one coming. It's the Liberal Democrats in the hung parliament, isn't it? Instagram.
Exactly, it is, yeah.
I do remember Instagram also being the deciding vote in the great Blessed v Shatner death match early on. And that was interesting. Early on, there was definitely a swell of support for Brian Blessed that was overtaken quite late in the day by Shatner's comeback. So there were some very good tussles in this thing that I didn't really see coming. I must say that I did think that it would come down to, in the end, Space Ritual versus the Sonic Attack album track. They feel like the two canon versions of it, the two kind of official released versions of it. But in the end, Bob's version with the Hawklords actually trumped Harvey's Sonic Attack album. Did you see that coming, or were you like me thinking it would come down to those two canon versions?
I was still hopeful that it would come down to Nick versus Bob. But I think in the back of my head, I knew that it was going to come down to Bob versus Bob. There's almost no escaping that.
It does show just how much love for Bob and his versions is out there in Hawkwind world, right?
It does. Bob's version is quintessential. It's what everybody had first heard for the most part for all of the older Hawkwind fans, and it's what has been set in their heads as being what it should be.
It sets a precedent, isn't it? When the original one is so performative, then the other ones are more, in a way, musical. Like, I know that when we first talked about it, I said I wouldn't call it a track, and I still kind of don't. It's something different than a track. For me, it's not a song. It is like a performance. And so for that to be the one that everyone hears, when you do more musical versions of the track, it kind of then, just by definition, others it from the original source material. So if you like what the original is really the only place to go, because no one else is doing a performance like it. You know, they're trying to make it more musical. They're trying to integrate the idea into a more musical setting. And in so doing means that you just fall away from what maybe makes the original great. I think this was always ever going to be a battle for second place when we did the deathmatch. You know, it was interesting to see it anyway, and it was interesting to see all the different versions out there. And there were some real variants, which was really cool. But just looking at the spread that we shared, when you see Bob Calvert on either side, it's kind of like seeing the Williams sisters at the early Wimbledons, where they just destroy everyone and get to the finals. And so kind of seeing Bob just wade through everyone, it kind of makes sense, which is why it was interesting to see what the second place one was going to be, because it was only ever going to be the best different version. And for me, that was the more interesting thing to look at.
Yes, that's true. The best placed of the non-Bob versions was the Harvey version from Sonic Attack. However, a different draw would certainly have produced different semi-finalists, probably not a different winner, but some of the Bobs could have come up against each other a little bit earlier. Some of the Nick versions, Nick only lost by tiny, tiny margins, but he seemed to be on the wrong end of a lot of flips. You know, if Nick comes up against Brian Blessed early on, he's through and swinging. So the draw certainly, you know, it's a tournament, not a league, and just a bit of fun. Bryan, we obviously picked purposefully for this. We needed to find versions that were good, clean recordings on YouTube so that people would be appreciating the version of the song rather than dismissing something because it was really horribly recorded, something like that. And everybody needed to be able to access it. That meant there were quite a lot of versions out there that didn't make it into our 16. And you mentioned to me off air a couple of different versions that you know of, even in different languages.
Yeah, a few years back, I had put together a compilation that I titled Use Your Wheels, It Is What They Are For. And it's Sonic Attack from 1972 to 2019. And I've tried to pull a version from every year to get the progression of how it went. There's at least 2 versions that are in multiple languages. In 2008, at Crescendo Festival, which was Jason Stewart's final gig, Mr. Dibbs and Tim Blake do a dual English and French version. And then in 2012 at the Inno Rock Festival in Poland, you have Mr. Dibbs and Marcin Babko from Hypersonic doing a English and Polish version. They're bootleg only. It's not an official release, but they're fabulous. You can tell from what Marcin's performance that he loves the song. It rolls off of his tongue as naturally as Bob would be doing it in English.
There's clearly so much more out there to find for lovers of Sonic Attack. Where would we be able to find your Use Your Wheels?
You'd have to come to the Hawkwind and Related Album History group because that's the only place that I've been posting it publicly. And if anybody's interested, they're more than welcome to join up. It's a Hawkwind love fest in there. We have ex-members. We have people who put on gigs. We have fans. We have you guys.
Before we go, I'd love to ask you about cover versions. We found one, which was really to make up the 16, which was Dr. Hasbeen. But in the flow of the conversations around this tournament as it progressed, more and more cover versions, completely non-Hawkwind covers, some of them incredibly inventive, like the guy with the ukulele and things like this. There are some astounding covers of this out there, aren't there?
There are. One of my favorite is Architectural Metaphor. They tread close to the traditional line for how Bob performed it, but they just do it so well for a 3-piece band.
That sounds great. We'll definitely find that and post it.
Talking about covers, is there a performer, living or dead at this point, that you'd love to hear them do a cover of it? Because, I was listening to all of these versions and I was trying to think, who would I like to tackle this in a way which maybe would help me understand it? And I was thinking someone like, Scott Walker or someone would be amazing to hear do a version of this, because I thought it was interesting that there was a Shatner version. And, Shatner's normally seen as a bit of a joke in terms of music, but his deadpan, slightly mumbling oration of this works because for me, it's not supposed to be sung. It is something which is supposed to be like said or shouted, and it's not musical. But if you go over the top with it, like the Arthur Brown and the Brian Blessed, it loses its power because it's already a bit ridiculous. So when you do it in a ridiculous way, you're not emphasizing it, you're actually watering it down. So I was just wondering, is there anyone that you can just jump to your head that would be like, do you know what? I'd love to hear a version done by
Tom Waits.
Oh, nailed it. That's nice. I was going to ping in that, although he can't do it now because he's dead, but I would have loved to have heard Richard Burton. That voice that you hear at the beginning of War of the Worlds, that voice would have been astounding. But Tom Waits, yeah, I like that. We need to start a petition.
Is Michael Burke still alive? Because I feel like, like getting an actual newsreader, with that kind of old gravitas might be kind of cool. Which then again leads you back into a potentially like more ambient play because it would act more like a sample than a performance. But yeah, I do think that there is still ways that this can be explored. So I'm hoping that this isn't the last time that someone messes with this track.
Absolutely. I think that's a great question to end on, actually, because we will put that out there to people. Who would you have record Sonic Attack? I can't wait to see who comes back. It'll take something to top Tom Waits, though. That would be pretty astounding. Bryan, I hope this won't be the last time we have you on board to talk about the music of Hawkwind. And thank you so much for all the good work with Hawkwind and Related Album History on Facebook.
Thank you very much.
So that was Sonic Attack, and thanks to Bryan for coming on board. That was really good to speak to him, and if you haven't had enough we have put together the Hawkbinge Sonic Attack Ultimate Deathmatch Tournament playlist on our YouTube channel with the 16 versions from the tournament plus 2 cover versions that we found. We challenge anyone to listen to all of that all the way through 18 straight different versions of Sonic Attack and retain any shred of sanity. So let us know if you manage to do it. Absolutely no prizes if you succeed. And with that, it's time to go back to 1982 and the release of Church of Hawkwind. And let's see, what world was Church of Hawkwind released into? Well, 1982, as we've kind of come to expect from the last couple of episodes, has a very eclectic set of albums coming out that year. Amongst them, Sister Sledge with the Sisters, XTC, underrated band, English Settlement, the Thompson Twins, remember them, with Set, Haircut 100 with Pelican West. They used to have acoustic guitars, but play them really, really high up on their chests so that they were almost hitting themselves in the face playing them, which was a source of endless amusement to me and my brother. The Jam come out with The Gift, Talking Heads, the name of this band, the live album. Brilliant it is too. Sonic Youth EP comes out that year. Broadsword and the Beast by Jethro Tull. Jump Up by Elton John. Van Halen released Diver Down in 1982. The Cure released Pornography. Frank Zappa, Ship Arriving Too Late to Save a Drowning Witch, which has some of the best cover art you will ever see. Queen's Hot Space, quite possibly the worst Queen album. Maybe not, maybe only the second or third worst. It might reach those kinds of heady heights. King Crimson released Beat, which is the second of those 80s albums that I talked about before. Robert Plant comes out with his first post-Zeppelin album, Pictures at 11. Elvis Costello, Imperial Bedroom. Judas Priest, Screaming for Vengeance is 1982. Talk Talk, The Party's Over. Aerosmith, Rock in a Hard Place. Remember Dexy's Midnight Runners? They have the album To Rye this year. They had the song Come On Eileen, which is very rarely have I hated a song as much as I hate and still hate Come On Eileen. I really hate it with a vengeance.
It's like your kryptonite.
It really is, yeah. Yeah, I mean, really, I've only mentioned it in this episode to try and exorcise that particular demon. Moving swiftly on, Cocteau Twins, Garland's Peter Gabriel 4, which is my personal favourite Peter Gabriel album, absolutely astounding. Kate Bush, The Dreaming, that's a pretty good year for progressive music as opposed to prog. Rush, Signals, Dire Straits, Love Over Gold, I remember they were everywhere about this time. Depeche Mode, Broken Frame, The Boss, Bruce Springsteen, comes out with Nebraska. Level 42, The Pursuit of Accidents. Was it Mark King was their bass player who seemed to be everywhere at that time? Prince, 1999. Culture Club, Kissing to Be Clever. Not sure if that's their first one or not, but again, they were a phenomenon. In Excess, Shabu, Shoe Bar, Phil Collins, Hello, I Must Be Going Again. Good Lord, you couldn't escape from Phil Collins in the early 80s. Led Zeppelin, Coda, their final album. Michael Jackson, Thriller. Well, didn't that change the game? Dead Kennedys, Plastic Surgery Disasters. The Sabbath live album, Live Evil, with Ronnie James Dio. Bauhaus, big favourite of mine, The Sky's Gone Out. Joni Mitchell comes out with an album, Wild Things Run Fast, in 1982. And Ultravox Quartet is also 82. So definitely a year with a huge amount of different things going on. So the question is, what are Hawkwind up to in 1982? We know that they've released Sonic Attack, they've been on tour, but they end up putting this album together, Church of Hawkwind, which is not just the name of the album, it's the name of the band as well. It's not Church of Hawkwind by Hawkwind. The album is just called Church of Hawkwind. There is a discussion that can be had about whether this is a Hawkwind album or a side project or a Dave Brock album. It's a strange one how it fits in. Obviously, we see it as canon because Wikipedia sees it as canon, so don't shoot the messenger. But let's look at how this album came to be. And in the book Sonic Assassins by Ian Abrams, he writes this. Recorded during an enforced break on the Sonic Attack sessions, due to Griffin contracting German measles, that's Martin Griffin, the drummer, was Church of Hawkwind, an additional unplanned album, a much different animal than the bleak tone of Sonic Attack. This was a predominantly electronic affair dominated by Brock and Bainbridge. Though it has its enthusiasts, it's an oddball entry into the canon that doesn't please all, and is possibly most intriguing not for its music per se, but because it shows Dave Brock once again thinking of ways in which the configuration of the band could be played around with and changed. Harvey Bainbridge says, Dave reckoned that we could in fact play guitars and synthesizers simultaneously, which I was a bit dubious about. But we began working out ways of doing that, linking them all together and having them triggered, with lots of experimentation going on. We had stuff that we wouldn't have put on Sonic Attack or Choose Your Masks because RCA wouldn't have thought that commercial enough, so we put them on another album, Church of Hawkwind. Dave tried to make it his own album, but it was essentially the third album for RCA. They are not all Dave's ideas. Brock himself went on to describe it as pretty much a solo album, but as to its realisation, Bainbridge reflected that, I quite like it, because it was getting into other areas. On the other hand, if we look at The Saga of Hawkwind by Carol Clark, she mentions at the end of the chapter on Sonic Attack that there were almost immediately more sessions, this time for Church of Hawkwind, a predominantly electronic affair. Recorded in collaboration with Rockfield's Kingsley Ward, it was essentially a Dave Brock album, though Harvey Bainbridge does some of the writing and all of the band members played. I wrote most of it, explains Dave. Harvey did some as well. It was the pair of us, really. Harvey's written some good numbers over the years that we've done. He was progressing from playing bass to going into keyboards and electronics. So it's either at the end of the Sonic Attack sessions or it's in the middle of them with Martin Griffin coming down with German measles. It's all a little bit up in the air. Suffice to say that it's something that they've kind of done on the side. It doesn't feel like it was planned to be the follow-up to Sonic Attack. And yet they end up in the studio and are experimenting with the electronics. And that's why actually there's a number of guest artists on this album. So you have the four from Sonic Attack, Dave Brock, Harvey Bainbridge, but Hugh Lloyd Langton on guitar also is on this album, and Martin Griffin does appear to play some of the drums. But also, there are some other people. There is a guy called Mark Spurhawk who plays the bass. And I found out from Carol Clark's book, Saga of Hawkwind, that Mark Spurhawk turns up much earlier in the Hawkwind story when Hawkwind effectively split up while on a US tour. Dave sells his guitar to a kind of a random fan, and that turns out to be Mark Spurhawk, who ends up with a credit playing bass on this album. Somebody called Captain Al Bodie, whose name rings a bell, but I can't place him, plays a bit of drums, don't really know who he is. The other three names are names to remember. You won't have come across these yet, Matt, but everybody else will recognise these names, and suffice to say, this isn't the last time you'll hear them. Alan Davey on bass, Richard Chadwick playing drums, and Chris Tate, the soon-to-be, or at some point becomes Mrs. Dave Brock, as the Crying Woman, who we will mention a bit later. So some names there who end up having quite a significant impact on Hawk history.
Have we heard of Alan Davey before?
So we haven't come across him in terms of the music, but he follows us on Twitter.
Right, that's it. Yeah, sorry. I remember I'd heard the name before, but I've obviously I've travelled in time to hear that name, so I'll forget it for now.
Yes, there you go. He is someone who you don't know yet, and you will come to know quite well. That is the cast of characters who end up putting together Church of Hawkwind. It's recorded in June to August of 81. And released May the 14th, 1982, it reaches number 26, which is pretty good, really, for this kind of album, given what we know of how Hawkwind were projecting themselves at the time. They went on tour for Sonic Attack with a band called Crocus, who I remember from the pages of Kerrang in the 1980s, which was solid reading for anyone in a computer studies course. White Dwarf was the other one, basically one under each arm. And it's produced by a certain Dr. Technical, which is actually Dave Brock. And Dr. Technical is the pseudonym that Dave Brock used for his production duties on Silver Machines. He basically brings back the Dr. Technical moniker. So that is where Hawkwind are at following Sonic Attack. It's now time to find out what Matt made of it.
So it's interesting from what you said from the book readings that this felt more like a project that was taken in between things or became a slightly more experimental thing, because that's very much what I got from this album. It's been a difficult one to really get my head around. It's probably one of the reasons, not the only reason, but definitely one of the reasons why this podcast has taken a bit longer to record, just because every time we've said, should we do it, I've kind of panicked a bit and said, I don't think I understand it enough to talk about it. And it really took until only like the last week where I really just tried to listen to it as many times a day as I could and try to understand what my issue with it was before I said, yeah, let's try and get this recorded, because I feel like overall, and perhaps because of Sonic Attack and Levitation before it, this album feels quite thin on multiple counts. I feel the production feels quite thin in terms of it has very few effects or multi-instrumentation that brings depth or substance to the sound like I'm normally accustomed to with Hawkwind. I feel some of the concepts are a bit thin, with less of the usual poetry or allegory that I expect from Hawkwind. It seems like a lot of straight-up space stories, which is fine if a little basic. I did feel like Brock is clearly all over this. It did feel like it could be a solo album from him, but unlike 25 Years, he feels much more present and much more domineering across all of it, where I feel like Brock was clearly doing his own thing, but formed a band around it. This felt much more like he's singing, he's playing. I feel like he's writing stuff, he's producing or doing something. You know, it did feel very much like a one-man show, and I felt like it was lacking probably because of that. It made me feel a bit like, I don't know the full history of Queen, but I watched a film, and so I'm just going to go with that. That when Freddie Mercury leaves Queen to go and do his own thing for a little bit, and then he comes back to Queen because he realizes that when he can do whatever he wants, it's not actually as good as he thought it would be. He needed people to say no. He needed people to add to it. I feel like if Brock is given full permission to do stuff, it's not as good as maybe he thinks it is, or at least how I think he thinks it is. You know, I feel like this is very much a thing, but it's not what I was expecting or really kind of liking, because it did feel a bit lackluster, like I said, in content, but also the way it's arranged and everything. It feels like it doesn't have the full Hawkwind vision behind it. And as Brock is very much in the driving seat of Hawkwind, there is much more to Hawkwind than Brock. So what I did last week is I stopped trying to listen to this album as an album like I normally do. And instead I started to listen to it more like a modern mixtape, the kind of thing that DJs and rappers do, where it's much more like fractions and sketches and bits of ideas. Sometimes they'll only last 2 seconds and then they'll crash into something else, you know, and they call it a mixtape because it's not arranged in the same way. It's much more designed to be experienced rather than listened to. And I started to listen to this album while I was doing other stuff like making dinner or walking the dog, and less like sitting down with a notepad, because as soon as I did, I just felt like I was just picking at it. And when I stopped listening to it as an album and more like this kind of collage of ideas, then I liked it more, and I felt like I started to get it a bit more. But also the fact that to really appreciate it, I needed to stop listening to it, I don't think actually does it a lot of service. It's more just like that's just the way I had to do it. But that is the way that I came to appreciate it in some way, shape or form. I think it's interesting that we have a space side and a fate side of the album. I know that fate has been an increasing theme recently, you know, with tracks like Lost Chances and even things like Fable for a Failed Race and maybe even Spirit of the Age. There's that idea of things happening to people and people either becoming the architects of their own fate or fate's happening to them, or talking about you can't change fate. A lot of people looking to the past or trying to change the past or being affected by the past. So I felt like that's a very Brockian idea. So it made sense that there was a space side and a fate side. I'm not sure if the sides really influenced the song selection, but again, I feel like it's showing Hawkwind's references, even if it's in a blunt forced trauma kind of way. I thought that was kind of interesting. I feel like in general, this feels like what you get when a band brings out an album of B-sides or studio experiments for Record Store Day or something. You know, it's not an album of the same quality or depth I've become used to, but it's an interesting collagic document of ideas that are presented and dismissed as quickly as they come. There are a few things that I do still enjoy, for sure, and I will definitely point out the things that I do like. I feel like overall it's a Brock Noodle album that makes me wanting more for the next album, but there are a couple of things where I do feel like, okay, some of this experimentation has definitely taken us somewhere nice, but again, for me, they are choice bits in an otherwise slightly thin and kind of lackluster album, if you're describing this as an album.
It's interesting that earlier I talked about King Crimson, because King Crimson at one point split up into lots of little subgroups and went off and did research and development. They called them the projects. And then that fed back into the next album. This album almost feels to me like R&D. and the next stuff benefits from what they did on this album. So I think it's interesting from that point of view. I didn't really connect with this when I first got it. I actually remember buying it in a secondhand record shop in Brighton when I was working for the Evening Argus in my first job. I think it was Vinyl Demand, and it had the booklet in it, which meant that it was like, yes, must buy this one now. Bought it, took it home, played it, didn't really connect, didn't play it again for a very long time. And every now and again it will come out because it's like, I don't really remember what's on this, so I'll play it. And then having satisfied that curiosity, it goes back in the box again. This time, obviously, it's had a very concerted and sustained set of plays, like numerous times in the same day, that kind of thing, which I don't think I've done before. So I've definitely got to know it a lot more. But yes, I think its effect on what comes after is perhaps more impactful than itself, which sounds like we're about to go in and be deeply critical of it track by track. But actually, funnily enough, that's not really the case, I don't think.
Well, we shall definitely see.
Yes, indeed. We kick off with Angel Voices,
which did not endear me to the album immediately and became not problematic, but certainly like one which I did actually start skipping as I listened to it, because I feel like it's very basic compared to previous things we've heard from Hawkwind, I feel, even in this kind of sci-fi intro that we've had from them before. You know, like it's full of meaningless sci-fi nonsense, like crystal absorption unit, proton drive, there's lots of activations, there's lots of modules. Good sci-fi takes an idea or a theme and then normally applies technology to it and brings you into a world. I think that's why Blade Runner works so well, because it was one of the first times when it was like, this isn't Star Trek. There's sci-fi, but it could be just as terrible and gritty and grimy as now. It doesn't have to mean that suddenly everything's amazing and clean and wonderful and starships, you know, that kind of thing. So I feel like we've had that from Hawkwind before. We've had great allegories from them. So them just saying things like, you know, crystal absorption unit, I feel like is meaningless sci-fi chatter for the sake of it.
Yeah, it's a bit like in Star Trek where they would suddenly realize that they could destroy whatever needed destroying by reversing the polarity of the graviton field generator, or a focused beam of tachyons or something like that.
Exactly. They're playing in a rule book that you don't understand because they can just make up a thing that suddenly they go, wait, I've got it. That experimental thing, yeah, where we turn the sun into a goose. And you're like, what? And then it just becomes like some way of doing something. You know, and it's fine. It brings a plot along. But when you're dealing with an album, if I start to hear too much of that language straight away, I do start to feel a little bit like, oh, God, here we go. So my alert was high as soon as I heard this. And it was further compounded by that use of the sample and hold style notes all over the place. You know, it becomes the computer is thinking noise, which is such like a stereotypical thing. And maybe in the 80s it was used more. But I was also thinking, like, can you imagine if computers actually made that noise in real life? We'd never have gone to the moon. We would have smashed the hell out of every single one of them.
It would be great. In fact, I kind of demand that I've got a ring modulator and I have several ring modulators. I might actually just build it in to everything that I work with. If somebody goes in Photoshop, can you just put that filter on? You've got to give it 2 or 3 seconds where it makes its blooping noises before you can say, oh, what do you think of this one? That would be great. I'm slightly more forgiving of this one than you. Hawkwind do a lot of this. We've had a lot of it. We're going to get a lot of it. I quite like them as a rule, but some are definitely better than others. Some feel like they've got more craft in them. So I don't mind this. I quite like it when the bass synth note comes in, that gravelly Moog type sound, and you get a nice filter sweep on it. So as it builds to the end, I quite like it. But yeah, it's a little bit by the numbers.
The thing I tried to think about this was why it was called Angel Voices. And my best guess is that this person who seems to be in space and is, you know, in possession of advanced technology might be seen like as an angel to any more primitive life form that he encounters. Or, you know, like if he goes down in his spaceship, people might be like, oh, is that an angel? But what we've heard is the almost mundane process of him doing some kind of technological chore, that idea of we're hearing the voices of the quote-unquote angel. It's almost like we're looking behind the curtain to see that wherever he lands, if people see him as angels, what we're seeing is very much the pilot or the person, removed of ceremony. And because we're hearing them do such banal calculations and programming, that maybe this is almost an ironic title of this is actually the voice of the angel. They're not saying anything heraldic or amazing. What they're actually doing is, please make sure my crystal absorption unit is correct or we'll all die. I don't know if there's some kind of interesting idea there, but it's all purely hypothetical. That's my best guess.
I've not given it that level of thought. So that's an interesting little thing to listen to, because it's definitely not something that's occurred to me. But I might give it one last blast through that lens and see where it takes me. I know where it takes us now. It is Nuclear Drive. The tune of the song and the beat and the rhythm is actually quite upbeat.
Yeah, tonally like Motorway City before it. It's very different to the previous track,
Yes.
And it also goes straight into the chorus, which is unusual. However, it's not the first time they've done this now. So I feel like this style of music warrants it, especially when Nuclear Drive is pretty much the only line in the chorus. It's very easy to sing along to. I think Brock's singing on this is good. I think the vocal has the same feeling of the guitar that soars over the track. For me, I can put it in the Motorway City vibe, slightly different, but it's got that kind of travel, it's got that kind of motion, it's got a lot of feel-goodness to it. The story just seems to be some dude's walking along, some ship comes down and says, hey, do you want to go somewhere? And they're like, sure. So, nice and simple.
It's the dream.
Yeah, apart from everything blows up.
Yeah, apart from that.
Someone did not sort out the crystal absorption unit in their nuclear drive or something.
Exactly. A focus beam of tachyons would have sorted that out. The little one-note riff that's underpinning it all the way through. The word jaunty springs to mind. Mm-hmm. Got a little bit of a bounce to it.
It is. It's almost naively happy for Hawkwind in a kind of fun way.
Yes, exactly.
There's a nice build to the end of it. Like it's doing kind of what it's doing, and then it starts to build into something, and then the explosion for me is completely exasperating after the build we've had. Mm-hmm. It feels like just a kind of another kind of cheap trick. I've never liked it really when they've done it. I feel like it's unnecessary. They were building to something to, again, just wipe it. This is where I feel like it's got that mixtape vibe where they're kind of like, well, we're done with that. We can't be bothered to end it. Let's do something else. And it might even be that that's what they did. I don't know how they recorded this. They might be they never actually got around to finishing it. So they're like, well, let's do that thing we do where we blow stuff up. Although last time it felt like they blew up the whole album because they were over Silver Machine.
Yes.
This one we've never heard before, so I don't think they're blowing it up for the same reason, like they hate it because we've only just been introduced to it. So I'm assuming it's some kind of technical thing. I mean, it might have been done on purpose, but I was being, flippant about the idea of the nuclear drive exploding, but maybe that is the point. I've no idea.
Could be. It could be.
I do find that the explosion happens and then there's about 20 seconds of fade out, which if you're going to kill the pace of your album, that is guaranteed to do, which just adds to my exasperation with these first two tracks.
Yeah, that's fair, particularly given that there's a natty little keyboard riff in the track that we are then taken to, which is Star Cannibal.
This one is one of my favorites on the album. I love the fact it fades in as if it's like awkwardly sidling in after the last track left this big silence hole. It's kind of like it blew up the stage and then this guy has to come in and be kind of like, hi, I'm a track, I'm on next. But the keyboard riff is really charming. It just fills in at the end of most bars and occasionally noodles for a little bit longer. It gives the track this really decent like lo-fi groove. For me, it takes me back to some of the 25 years stuff where you just feel like, yeah, just a few little notes is just enough to just like wrap the whole thing and just keep it chugging along. It's not fast or driving, but it is certainly going somewhere. This almost has a kind of jaunt to it again.
Absolutely.
It feels like it's played with a little like pluck. You can just feel someone just pecking the keys as it goes along, just like while they're doing something else. And maybe they are. Maybe they're playing the guitar whilst also going, oh, I need to do my little keyboard thing. Maybe this is like one of those examples that you said. So that might also be why some of the tracks feel a bit thinner than what I was saying in terms of like it's not layered in the same way, because if they are trying to play every instrument at once, then you can't get the same layering. But this track doesn't feel encumbered by a lack of layering. This one actually for me works really nicely. You've got the bass on one hand, you've got the little top on the other. They're having a nice interplay. If anything, the bass feels a bit rushed compared to the riff on the main synth. It feels a little bit like it's trying to play as many notes as it can in its bar. And sometimes it doesn't feel like it's completely on time, but that also added to the charm of the piece because the piece is so lo-fi that it's actually kind of fun when it's feeling a little less on the beat and just feels a little bit more meandering.
Yeah, I wonder if this were being approached as a full-on Hawkwind follow-up to Sonic Attack, they would have spent a lot more time making this significantly more dense and adding bits to it. Whereas actually, the form it's in, it's kind of exactly what it needs to be, particularly with its funny little lyric about the star cannibal and the fondue and all, which actually does bring me to a small bone I do have to pick with this track, which is...
Fondue?
Yes, fondue. On Somnia, we had to deal with the deliberate mispronunciation of grimace in order to make it rhyme with something, which I can forgive because it's an attempt to make one thing rhyme with another. Here, you have fondue that's supposed to rhyme with stew and crew, and it does that job perfectly fine. Why do you deliberately mispronounce it fondue so that it doesn't rhyme with either of those two words? And I come from a time when people had fondues. No one ever called it a fondue. If you were trying to make it rhyme with sure or law or something like that, then it would be like grimace. And I go,
yep.
I really hate that, but I'm going to excuse it because you have to make it rhyme. I don't understand. I don't understand.
I don't either. No, I had the same note. I actually think that the vocals are weird in both content and delivery throughout the whole thing. It's closer to a Hawkwind story than I'd expect, with the idea of some space pirate or criminal or monster or something that eats his hapless victims. But Brock kind of really leans into some of this in his delivery, more spoken than sung. But because of that, I couldn't understand a single word until I looked at the lyrics. And then when I looked at them, I was like, wait, what? That's what they're saying? That's weird. And that's what that's when I got to this whole fondue thing. I feel like the lyrics and the music don't really go together. The music is kind of loungy and chill and lo-fi and a bit upbeat, if anything. And the lyrics sound more like it's something that should be screamed over the top of a raucous jam rather than just la 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 la, someone's going to eat your face, do 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 do. You're like, wait, what? This is tonally very disparate. I don't really understand.
The video for this would be like a hand-drawn animation.
Yeah, or some kind of when people do ironic Muppets or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I do find that entertaining, except for fondue, which is not how he always pronounces it. So it's not how he regularly says it, because he's capable of saying fondue. He does at certain points.
It sounds like at some point there's two people actually singing in chorus, which means there's someone else who was given that lyric sheet and went, it's fondue, is it? Okay, fine. They didn't point out they didn't point out that it's wrong. They just say, all right, Brock, whatever you want, man.
It's so weird. It doesn't make me hate the track because actually, like you, I really like it. I think it's one of the high points on the album, but I can't help thinking whenever it comes up, I just really notice it.
I excuse it for unearthly human crew, which is a really nice thing to say and also fits really nicely over the track. So I do like that.
As opposed to unearthly human crew, which doesn't.
No, would make no sense. I think the sparseness of the track really works for it.
100%.
I love the synth towards the end, which kind of turns into this alarm sound to round out the track as it slowly builds up in its repetition. I think the bass chills out a little just at the end when it's kind of doing its little noodly solo, which I really like because it's a nice bass tone. I just think it always feels a little bit rushed. Even then, this distorted guitar that comes in at the end just to bring in this sinister feel, I'm like, okay, fine, cool, great. Even the fade I will agree with in this one because it feels like we're just adding this extra bit and it ends nicely. So yeah, for me, this has a kind of 25 years on vibe to it somehow in the way that it's put together. I think it's nice. There's a lot I like in this.
It's a good shout. And interestingly enough, there is a musician called Jane Weaver, and this came to my attention through friend of the pod, Joe Banks, as ever. And Jane Weaver has talked about how influential Hawkwind were on her in the 80s, and this album in particular. And she released an album in 2014. And on that album is a track called The Electric Mountain. And she loved this track so much that she wrote to Dave Brock and said, can I effectively just take this and put a different vocal track on it? And Dave said yes, and she did, and definitely worth looking up. I really, really like it. She takes it somewhere slightly different, but the vocal melody is really, really nice, fits the track. She hasn't messed with the little riffs and things at all. It's got a great feel to it. So anybody out there who isn't aware of Jane Weaver, The Electric Mountain, check that one out, look it up. We'll put a link out to that one to have a listen. We move on to The Phenomenon of Luminosity.
Which is a cool name for a track.
Yes.
I'm trying to work out if the vocal in it is a sample or if it was made for the album. I feel normally when American voices are in Hawkwind, they are samples. I'm wondering if it was a sample of someone like in a submarine talking about some kind of bioluminescent animal that they were going past in a porthole or something. It sounds real. It sounds like someone recounting their experience underwater. But, I feel like it's been turned into this more fantastical idea. So I thought that was cool. The thing which gets me is that the synth voice is set to what I would call sinister space duck, which I think we've talked about before. And I just find that it's very difficult to get out of my head once I hear it. So that duck riff really bothers me. But under the duck riff, there's something much more epic and sci-fi. I was wondering if it was a Yamaha CS80, which is known normally as the Blade Runner synth. I can't tell, but it sounds very much like that. It's bigger and spacier and has pitch warbles and that kind of thing. And I really like that bit, but I do find the duck is hard to tune out. So it's a short little idea that does what it needs to, I guess. Adds to the feeling of mixtape vibes again as a thought which was had and then removed. I'm kind of glad it doesn't last too long as the duck voice starts to wear on me, but the bit underneath I really like, and I hope that they do something with that in future, with that big kind of wall of sound synth. It's a nice sound.
Yeah, agreed. It's another of those tracks that kind of shouts R&D to me. We've got this nice little thing, let's just put it down, not expand it, look to rework it, layer it, turn it into something bigger. It's just a cool idea, let's stick it down. It doesn't outstay its welcome. I never remember it. It always takes me by surprise when it comes up, and then somewhere later, and I'm halfway through side 2, I've kind of forgotten that it happened, and I kind of just enjoy it while it's there, but it doesn't leave any lasting imprint on me. Takes us to something quite interesting in The Fall of Earth City.
This reminds me of a very deep cut that you and I discovered in London, which was a album called Galactic Nightmare by Alan Jefferson.
Yep, it was his version of War of the Worlds, wasn't it?
Exactly. He loved War of the Worlds. He wrote his own story. He learned his own synthesizers. He learned how to record and learned how to synthesize and everything and put this thing together. I think over the course of like 6 years. Yeah, I've got it here. I'm just checking online. It was 1979 to 1985. So it would actually be in production while this is happening, which is hilarious. It was some guy who just over the course of 6 years recorded onto CS90 cassettes this strange hour-long story. I'll definitely link it. I think it's all sold out because Trunk Records bought the copyright and made a limited pressing of it, and I have one, and it's amazing. And this really reminds me of that in terms of it's a space story set to music. This is way superior in terms of fidelity and quality and everything. Like the first track, it feels very sci-fi in big quotes to me. It feels a bit like, oh, it's Sector 17 and, that kind of stuff. And I'm like, fine. Oh yeah, space is made of sectors. Of course it is. It just feels a bit thin, a bit first thought for me. Also, the way Brock reads it makes me feel like he's reading it for the first time because it's not orated amazingly. I feel it's also a bit rushed in writing because there's a bit where they say ancient time sleeper from the time before. You're like, do you want to rewrite that so it doesn't have time in it twice? It feels a little lazy for what it is. However, there are some great bits in it. Like I love ancient soil kissed the sky as a way of saying basically the planet blew up. And that idea of leaving green things only in the wells of immortal minds, talking about how long it's been since Earth wasn't just a giant city. So, there's some nice thoughts in it. It's not as original as a lot of things that I feel like Hawkwind have touched on before. The idea of Earth being a whole city, I'm sure, is in millions of sci-fi stories. It just feels a bit tropey. I think that's the word I'm looking for. I think this falls into some tropes which I feel are beneath Hawkwind. But that said, for what it is, if I'm looking at it as a thing that they've done, the music sits really nicely with the story. I think actually the music really helps it along. The synth chords at the end are a nice coda to the whole thing. There's an intensity as they talk about what's befelt the earth. I was wondering if this would have worked better on the fate side, because for me, this feels more like a fate story.
Yeah, agreed.
They found this coffin, they didn't have to open it, but they did, and that was their fault, and now they were all dead. There's like the space arc of the Covenant. They were warned not to, but they did it anyway.
Yeah, that's about right. It's a very interesting one, and I do like this track. And it's one of the ones that prior to getting the album out to prep for this, I'd forgotten about, and then was pleasantly surprised and listening to it again. The writing credit on this is for all 4 of the band members. But it's unusual in that this kind of writing would previously, to my mind, have come from Bob Calvert or Michael Moorcock. I can't remember Dave having written effectively a piece of prose. This is a piece of narration with music underlying it. And I'm not aware of Dave having done that before. So it doesn't feel like his kind of style. So I'm wondering whether he did write it or whether it's from something that I'm not aware of. As you said, it lacks the lyricism of a really great prose writer. But it's a nice idea, and I quite like it. I can get lost in it. And it's one of those ones that I certainly wouldn't mind if there was a little bit more to it. But as you say, also would have fit quite well on the Fate side, given its theme. Which leads us to The Church.
I think The Church is quite pretty sounding. It's got these quite glistening synths that shine over the guitar and what sounds like a kind of call to prayer or some kind of shouted chant over it. I think it's very atmospheric. I actually think this would have been a nice intro track. For me, this is quite evocative of something. I'm not quite sure what, so I like that as it starts to stoke my imagination, but feels like I'm not where I am when I'm listening. It transports me somewhere interesting. So yeah, I would have thought this would have made quite a nice intro track, but so it goes. It's weird that considering this is as close to a title track as we've got, it's so short. I don't really know what to do with that other than be surprised. It also sounds like it's live. It sounds like there's some crowd noise, which I actually don't like. I'd prefer they weren't there, because then it makes me feel like it's a performance rather than a bit of audio placement, which would drag me somewhere. So I go from feeling transported to a potential time and place to feeling transported to I'm at a gig, which is fine, but it's not where I expect to be. I love the minor guitar that comes halfway through it, that proto-desert stuff. I get that Opeth vibe again. I think that's really nice. Detailed recording sounds great. It's just very short, and I was hoping that this would evolve into something much bigger. When I first heard it, I remember thinking, oh, cool, this is going to be the Hawkwind track that I need in this album. And then it was like, psych, nope, we're 40 seconds long, bye. And I was like, oh, okay, fine. Another mixtape thought, here today and gone tomorrow. But for what it is, there's something in it, and considering that Hawkwind are certainly not beyond remixing and re-inspiring from their previous stuff, I hope they find something to do with that at some point. If this is a preview of coming things, then I'll be excited about it.
You saying it could be a good intro is really insightful, because actually if you were to put this in place of Angel Voices, and that guitar thing that they come in with at the end of this track, the bit that kind of fades it out on, which I love those little guitar lines at the end of this track. If they actually melded into the beginning of Nuclear Drive, that would be a way better beginning for the album. It's a good thought. I wish this was longer. I really like it. Differently to you, I like the crowd bit. So you've got the crowd in there who are chanting Hawkwind. And the two things about that is I love that as the underlying thing, that the pseudo-religious bit over the top happens. But also, to me, it suggests that the concert is the Church of Hawkwind. And I quite like that implication as well. I like that as a connection. And then the guitar line that comes at the end, I could sit and listen to that for a good number of more minutes.
Right, exactly.
Sticks around so briefly. And so, yeah, like you, I would have loved to have seen that built into a full-on track. But yeah, I like pretty much all of that. And it's a pretty strong end to side space.
Yeah, I was wondering why it was Church of Hawkwind, and I was wondering if this track was going to extrapolate that thought in any way, but for me it doesn't. Considering that things like 25 Years developed a whole manual of ways to live your life that someone fell into, rebelled against, and fell apart from, and we've had things like Space Ritual, which felt ritualistic, which felt like a performance and that kind of thing, to call yourself Church of Hawkwind, which sounds quite fundamentally like you're trying to make some kind of point, and then to almost not address it at all. is surprising. Even if this is a bit of a more ephemeral type of album that they've done in between some of the more meatier, meaningful albums, I'm surprised that this is what it ended up being called. And so, I was hoping for some answers in this track, which I didn't get. Your idea, I think, is cool, but it's like an idea that we have to come to rather than feeling like we're going to be taken down a thought exercise that Hawkwind have come up with, which, again, I'm kind of used to at this point. But for it to not be there, it feels like kind of like a wasted opportunity in a way, because they can't really use church again now they've done that. They kind of spent it. So to spend such a word with so much gravitas and history and potential, either controversial feelings or feelings of faith or, all these things, such a word with so much riding on it, to use none of that is perplexing to me. But this is where we are.
Indeed it is. Which brings us to then side one. We flip the album over, put the needle back on, and we are treated to The Joker at the Gate,
which has probably the best synth voices we've heard thus far, I think. Big, plucky, bassy, jabby, fun. That's the kind of noise I want a synth to make. I love the sequencing on it. I do think it's a nice arrangement, both in power and the melodic qualities it has. This is the first time I think we've really had effects on the vocals, which make it feel more Hawkwind. We have these stuttering echoes and a wider stereo field, so it just kind of makes the vocals slip around a little bit. But I feel like the delivery itself is kind of mumbly and lacks conviction, which makes me feel like it's kind of more of a bed or a pad than actually like the main point of it. I find it difficult to necessarily hear exactly what it's saying. And when I looked at the lyrics, I was like, oh, it doesn't really have the power that I was expecting. So I like the musicality of what we have here. Joker at the Gate, again, I feel like there's some ideas which could be explored there, which I feel kind of aren't. And the whole thing feels, again, a little thin. So I think it's fine, but I don't think it goes above fine for me. There's a lot of musical thought.
No, that's fair. I think vocally and lyrically, it's probably the weak point on the album, but musically, it's not bad. The combination of those two things kind of average it out. So again, it's a little bit like the phenomenon of luminosity. I don't mind it while I'm hearing it, but I don't particularly remember it after it's gone. Takes us to something quite interesting, though. Some People Never Die.
This, for me, is the track which saved it the first time I listened to it. We'd had the Star Cannibal, which I'd liked on the first hear, and it was then having to do quite a lot of work to then make up for the next couple of tracks, which it got to. And I was like, this better not be the only blip, because there's been like 4 tracks between that and then this, Some People Never Die, which is almost, I'd say, like, it feels more like art than a track, the way that it's been put together. And I'll try and justify my thinking behind that. I think it's because it sounds like it's performed rather than played. It sounds like someone has this sample of news recording and a band recording and a synth and the effects, and they're all like in some kind of mixer, and they're just playing with the faders. It feels more like I can hear someone mixing all these things together in a kind of, not quite musique concrète, but more like a DJ or someone who's making a performance of recording stuff, more like a Philip Glass thing or something, compared to it being performed. And I feel that because like the band fades in and then gets really loud and really quiet, as it really feels like someone's like banging on a fader. Same thing with the synth and with the sample, and it's definitely a sample this time. I know this one. I remember seeing the footage when I was doing history back at school. Oswald being shot as he was led out of the police precinct.
Yeah, by Jack Ruby.
Yeah, it's this crazy performance. I think it's great, the fact that the opening of it feels like I accidentally skipped to I Feel Loved by Donna Summer or something. It's much more like a dancey kind of synth loop, which then kind of bubbles down into this bed that they start to play the samples over. It's interesting that this is on the Fate side, because I was trying to listen to what we have here, which is literally history being recorded and then repeated back to us. And the fact they call it Some People Never Die, again, trying to interpret that title, trying to figure out whether or not it means some people never die because they do things which are historically significant, or is it some people never die because they're now recorded and this is now an age of recorded news, and the fact that you can then take those recordings and those recordings can then be turned into other things like what we're listening to here in this performance. Or is it Some People Never Die and that's either a good or a bad thing because they have Oswald, who obviously shot Kennedy, getting shot. Or did he? That is another podcast that I will not get into. either way, is it the idea of like both good and bad people can get shot, so they become immortal? And does it mean that your actions are different and they both get you to the same place? This kind of immortalness, the idea of you literally died on film, but you also didn't die because the film will be shown again. You know, there's lots to think about, and I feel like Hawkwind have done an interesting thing here, which they cleverly do, which is making me think about all this whilst not actually addressing any of it, apart from presenting it back to me in this musical form. But, you know, I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in an interesting way. You know, like the ending of Quark's Strangeness and Charm, you have that music that just makes you think, oh no, the government's about to get these people. And that's all just implied sonically. Same thing with this. I feel like by just playing us back this history with this title and like this music that I'm not quite sure what the music is adding. It's definitely adding something, but it's feeling like the music could almost be seen as a flippant addition, but it's not. I feel like the fact that it's upbeat and a bit raucous, I feel like it might be some kind of commentary on the idea of important parts of history being recorded and reshared in such a strange manner, almost like this becoming a radio play. Like that person who's interviewing Kennedy, and then like Kennedy literally gets shot in the head in front of him and he starts narrating what's going on. It seems such a strange thing to do, isn't it? Like normally you just run or scream or something, but he starts narrating it almost like he was expecting it to happen. It's so strange. And then the music just adds this surreality to it where it feels like it could be something out of Blue Jam or something, you know, such an odd Chris Morris performance of something.
That's a good shout. The Blue Jam thing is very evocative of the kind of mood. Yeah, it's a strange one. I used to wonder about the choice of the two events, i.e. Lee Harvey Oswald being shot by Jack Ruby and then Bobby Kennedy being shot. The obvious two things to join together for me would have been JFK and then Lee Harvey Oswald. But then I found out that the exact two same clips are used in a track by a band called On the Seventh Day, who I've never heard of, with a track called They Call Me Gun that I'd never heard of. The tracks are entirely different, but they use these two commentaries and then do something with it. So I wonder whether there was little more thought to it than the fact that Dave heard that and thought, those are two good pieces of commentary, I'll do something with that, which now feels quite likely. I like it, to your point. It fits in that Hawkwind present day issues based reality thing. But it sits in the middle of an album which is not that, like a huge brick. So I quite enjoy listening to it. I think it's strong, but it feels strangely out of context with the rest of the album. In a way, it ought to be on Sonic Attack because of its setting. But yeah, it's an interesting one for sure. I do think that musically it is strong. As you say, when you watch documentaries about these things, there will always be a soundtrack. It's not just the soundtrack, it's doing something more than that. But it's quite hard to put your finger on. But yeah, it's a very interesting experiment.
The only thing that I ding it on is the fact that it blows up. It feels like Hawkwind loses faith in the idea and just blows it up and moves on, which is a shame because I would like it to have ended. I guess considering the almost randomness of the whole thing, it blowing up is the least egregious of all of the ones that blow up, but I still don't appreciate it.
Again, it comes back to smacking of that whole R&D vibe to me, where the whole package doesn't feel like it's intended to be the next Hawkwind album. It's the place where they're learning and tinkering and doing things, and therefore they're not too worried about crafting the endings of things, which is interesting how it's ended up being part of the canon as it is. And an interesting album because of that, really, that does bear listening to and some investigation. Light-specific data, Matt, is the next one.
The title reminds me of those experiments that I remember trying to understand in physics and not being able to understand, but you can get those experiments where the results change if you look at them or not.
Yeah, the wave or particle thing.
Yeah, exactly. That always broke my head and I never really understood it, but it felt a little bit like that about light-specific data. This feels familiar somehow, like it's from a previous Hawkwind jam or something. Like, I can't remember the name of the track, but it's like a jam that there's like a mumble part of it where they sort of go, do you remember?
Yeah,
you remember that track?
I do.
I was trying to find it. I was trying to skip back through albums. Unfortunately, as we go through more and more albums, and I try to find the track I can't remember the name of, I have way more tracks to go through, so I couldn't find it. But anyway, I felt like I could do that mumbly song over this, so I was wondering whether or not it was the same notes or chord progression or something. So there was something slightly familiar about it. I think it's fun, it's busy, it's buzzing, it's kind of noodly, it's got some energy to it. It feels like something I'd expect from Hawkwind in the way it builds chords and the way it works, but again, it's so short, it feels like the start of a thought that isn't fully realized. And again, it blows up. And I remember writing down in my first notes, are we in a Westwood Radio 1 show at this point with everything blowing up that we can see? I don't really understand what's going on. It's exactly what you said before. It's on when it's on, and when it's gone, it is, because I don't feel like it's treated with a huge amount of reverence from the producers. Therefore, I find it hard to retain in my memory, especially after we've just had something which is such a thought piece as Some People Never Die.
No, absolutely. We're very much on the same wave with this one, and I'm where I was with Joker at the Gate and Phenomenon of Luminosity. It's another interesting little aside that I'm quite happy with while it's there, but it doesn't really linger for me after the fact. And, when I kind of get back to the beginning, having heard all the other tracks, I'd be struggling to remember how it went. Nice little piece. On any other album, it would be one of the interludes between two big tracks. On this one, it's a little bit more of a track unto itself. Not the strongest, but not horrible. The next one's interesting because when it was called Virgin of the World and it had vocals, you really liked it. So now it's called Experiment with Destiny and it doesn't have the vocals. Do you still like it?
I like it as an instrumental, but I do miss the chant over the top. I think the riff is still really lovely as a thing. I feel like to build it and make it last and hold attention, the chant is useful. I think we said before, I thought in 3 lines they were able to get quite an interesting bit of information out there for me to mentally chew on while I listen to this. So I like it. I'm glad it's back. I was thinking if I could put this into the playlist, because I didn't put Virgin of the World into the playlist last time. I thought, oh, this is maybe a chance for me to put it in, but the randomness at the end kind of spoils it for me. I just want that riff to carry on for a while and then dissipate nicely. This ending feels like we've got this amazing, wonderful, pristine lake that I'm gazing over, and then Hawkwind drive by and throw a rusted oil barrel into it for no reason at the end, and completely ruins my chill vibes. So no, unfortunately, I like the riff. I don't like anything else about it, and I find the end a bit sacrilegious, to be honest.
No, fair. You were a big fan of Virgin of the World, so I was actually thinking ahead when you said on the Sonic Attack episode how much you liked Virgin of the World. I was thinking ahead and thinking, I wonder what Matt's going to make of this. Well, now we know. Definitely second best to its original version. And we come to Chris Tate, who is the crying woman in The Last Messiah.
By the end of this album, my attention is always waning, even when I'm really trying. So for this to be where it is as well, probably doesn't set it up for success a huge amount. There's some nice sounds. I quite like the stuttering kind of laser stabs that lash out over a very Casio sounding melody and then that drone underneath it. So that's perfectly fine, if unremarkable, I would say at this point. The crying on the track does absolutely nothing for me. I don't really know why it's there. I was wondering if it was somehow linking to the fact the track was called The Last Messiah and someone's really upset about that. But to be honest, that's as far as I got. I'm actually kind of glad that this is a thought that ends quickly, because it's just slightly annoying to have this sniveling in one speaker while I'm trying to listen to the rest of it. I don't know what it's trying to achieve. I unfortunately get nothing out of it, and the exhaustion that I start to get from this album doesn't mean that I'm particularly charitable towards it. So sorry to anyone who likes this. But as soon as this comes on, I mentally roll my eyes a little bit and just wait for it to go away.
If you had to cut one from the album, this would be the one for me too. It doesn't really do anything. If you had a whole bunch of experiments and noodling around, and some of them you could make something out of and some of them you couldn't, this one to me would have been in the, could we do something with this? Nah. And it would have been an extra, like in the re-releases that have come out since, with lots of unused versions and different things and stuff that didn't quite make the album. The crying, yeah, I never really liked it when I first heard it, and that opinion didn't really change. Again, don't hate it while it's on. I kind of go with it, but I'd be quite happy if it wasn't there. It doesn't really do anything, doesn't move me any particular way. But we do end with something that sounds like a Sonic Attack sounding song, Looking in the Future.
I still, after all this time, don't really know what to do with this track. It feels like a lot of ideas that fell on the floor were swept up and combined together to make the MDF equivalent of a Hawkwind track. The fact it's got the classic lyrics from Assault and Battery at the beginning.
You do love Assault and Battery, though.
Assault and Battery, I never had a problem with the lyrics. I thought the lyrics were cool. I thought the music was annoying. In this case, the music is fine, but the delivery of the lyrics is atrocious. For me, I think it really does the original a disservice. I don't know why they thought that would be a good idea. You should just leave those lyrics in that track where it belongs and not try to just breathily wheeze them out over something which is nowhere near as good as a riff. So I think this feels like a grab bag, a bit like the end of PXR5 or something. You know, it just feels like everything else that we had an idea for that we haven't made a track out of, let's all just squodge it together and see what happens. I do quite like the ending though. I like the way they found a way to make all the sounds kind of eventually like smear together into this new tone that undulates in and out for a moment and eventually disperses into nothing. That ends the album on quite a nice flat nothing, which is exactly where the album is. Kind of by that point in my brain, they didn't explode it, and the fact they didn't explode it gets them at least one extra point.
That's true. Musically, it feels to me like something they already had that didn't quite make the grade for Sonic Attack, but the ones on Sonic Attack are stronger, which is probably why they were chosen for Sonic Attack. And if my massive, absolutely zero evidence guess is that this was one of them and didn't make it, this is why. And yes, those lyrics, they don't really fit this track. It feels like Dave is having to really try to make the lyrics fit the track, because naturally they don't. And the effort shows. And you'd kind of rather, if you were going to reuse the lyrics, you reused the lyrics on a track where the lyrics at least fitted in terms of the sounds of the words and the meter of the words and the length and the number of syllables in a sentence, those kinds of things. But it doesn't really, and Dave's really trying to make it fit, which is a bit of a shame. So it's not a horrible end to the record, although what I've just said makes it sound like it is. It's not ghastly, and I think it's good to have something that is at least a song to end the album with, rather than another noodly R&D experiment. And I don't mind the noodly R&D experiments when they're between tracks, but when you get a lot of them one after the other, you kind of yearn for something with a beat. And this does at least round it out. You've got Nuclear Drive at the beginning, this at the end, although obviously you start with Angel Voices, but you know what I mean. And it does at least round it out. But yeah, of those kinds of songs that Hawkwind do, for me, neither Nuclear Drive nor Looking in the Future are up to par with the tracks that we've heard on Sonic Attack, or that we then come to hear on other ones coming down the line. They're just a little bit thinner, a little bit weaker for me. So yes, that brings the album to a close. And what a strange hodgepodge of an album it is. And we both found some things that we liked in there, and we both found some things that puzzled us. But before we come to draw our conclusions on this album, let's take a look at the cover art, which is very, very different. It's by Andrew Christian and Partridge Rushton, and Partridge Rushton apparently is part of Partridge Rushton Associates, so I'm guessing those are two different people rather than one person called Partridge Rushton. Andrew Christian, of course, was partly responsible for the Sonic Attack album cover. We're not sure which bit was his. And he has, I did find, a number of interesting credits to his name in terms of album design. He did albums for Eurythmics, David Bowie, Bucks Fizz, Budgie, Dokken, Lionel Richie, Slade. That is a weird grab bag of different artists from different genres. But at least, you know, he's done a fair bit of work. He also does some work on Choose Your Masks. Partridge Rushton Associates credits, there were only 2 or 3 of them, but they did include the same Bowie and Slade albums as Andrew Christian and are present on Choose Your Mask. So they obviously work together to some degree, but Andrew Christian has a number of albums to his name. And an interesting one in being effectively kind of a logo for Church of Hawkwind, but with some interesting elements in it.
It's hard to digest this album cover in a way. It sort of reminds me, I'm not quite sure why, but it reminds me of the kind of printing that you might get on a disposable cup that you get from a vending machine. It's got this strange texture and color to it that I guess is 80s-ish, but it's very low contrast in a lot of it, whilst at the same time feeling like it's all very much on one plane. It seems kind of uninspired to me, compared to, you know, again, some of the other stuff that we've seen from Hawkwind in the past. This has gone back to almost levitation, but instead of a ship projecting something onto a alien world that we were assuming, it feels like this is just a projection, but a slightly more basic version. We've got the pyramid. Instead of the eye, we've got some kind of blazing sun, which looks a little bit like a child drew it, to be honest. It looks like it was done in crayon. You've got these kind of either devil horns or some kind of circle in the back. It's got wings because Hawkwind, I guess. And then it just has Church of written on it. Even though it's all in capitals, the capital C of church and capital O of are slightly bigger. So it's all caps, but some caps are more caps than others. And then it seems to have some kind of texture which looks a bit like if a bug hit a windscreen and then you used your windscreen wipers, that's what was left of the bug on the screen. For me, it kind of looks like, or some kind of like odd smeary thing, adding some kind of texture over the top. I guess the most interesting thing for me is the font of Hawkwind, which looks cool. Maybe a bit Germanic again, a bit like how we've had before. Certainly very angular and very cutting. It certainly stands out on this sea blue, grey colour that the album has decided to be on. For me, the whole thing feels a little bit like First Thought, and I would expect to see this as a sketch and then me to hand it back and go, cool, work it up and that will be good. And I'd expect the wings to look more like wings. I'd expect the fire to look more like fire. But it seems to be instead they looked at that and went, cool, print, perfect, done. It's just a bit flat and a bit cardboardy or something for me.
It kind of feels in keeping with the random nature of the stuff on the album. If this R&D thought process is actually genuine and not just something I've completely concocted out of thin air, then it kind of fits. Weirdly, the colour scheme of this, i.e. the orange and that blue colour and the pink, is used on the back of the album, where you just get a repeat of the front of the album at the top. But then you get the track listing and the names of all of the writers and performers. And as illustration, the orange and the pink and the blue in big blocky elements as you have, they're okay. But when you start writing in that orange on silver and that pink on the silver, it's a little bit difficult. But the front album does make for a good t-shirt. I do have the grey t-shirt with this on. Interestingly, the back of the album just has a photo of Dave, which lends an element of credence to the idea that Dave thought of this as a Dave album, because there's certainly no photographs of anyone else from the band.
I do like actually what you just said there, that looking at this album artwork and hearing what I hear, you're right, this album looks like how it sounds. If you put the Astounding Sounds artwork on this and then heard the album, I think you'd be way more confused, where this almost looks like the kind of thing like when I was much more of a DJ back in my youth. I used to get white labels sent to me occasionally, and that was that kind of thing where they'd literally got it hot off the press and they were giving it to DJs to play to see what the crowd reaction was, you know, that kind of preview. And you'd get sleeves like this, which were just literally like drawn in a second just so you remember what it was. Or sometimes you just get literally like a white labeled record with nothing on it apart from maybe someone might write in Sharpie or just stamp really quickly what it was. This has that same thing. It feels like it's been almost deliberately got out in a rush, and that's the kind of thing you might mail this out. And that's why I'm thinking like this would be the kind of mailer that a promo radio DJ might get and then would expect later on to see a better worked up version for the actual commercial release. And that didn't happen. It just stayed as is. And maybe not working it up helps that idea of it being a bit more cut and paste DIY mixtape vibe, and rather than doing a full album artwork rendition when I guess they were in the middle of also commissioning Sonic Attack and Choose Your Masks, maybe getting a third one was difficult, so maybe they just got this as a bit of like a freebie or something. I don't know, but yeah, you're right, the scrappiness of this certainly tees you up a bit more for what you're about to experience.
Yeah, I think so. Now, in the version of the album that I got, and the first versions of the album that came out, there was a booklet included that had a whole bunch of illustrations and some of the lyrics. And we are about to clear up a 40-year-old mystery, because the illustrations in this booklet are credited to John Coulthard and Tim. Now, John Coulthard, obviously he of the full name, his work in here is quite recognisable. He does the big, blocky, black and white illustrations rather than the hand-drawn things. If you've got it, you'll know what I'm talking about. If you haven't got it, we are actually going to reproduce this and put it up in the same place where we put the Hawklords booklet and the In Search of Space logbook. We'll put that up there. John Coulthart is actually a pretty famous guy. He was born in 1962. He's a British graphic artist, illustrator, author and designer who's produced book covers, illustrations, CDs, did a cover for the book called The Haunter of the Dark and Other Grotesque Visions, which I have. Has collaborated with Alan Moore. He's been nominated for a British Fantasy Award for Best Artist. So he's a pretty well-known guy, and he's done some other work in music. So John Coulthart, pretty famous illustrator. And as I say, when you're flicking through this booklet, the things that he does, they very much stand out, that there are two very different styles of things in this book. The other ones, the kind of illustrations of warriors and spacemen and things like that, are by Tim. But Tim who? Well, we found out, have we not, Matt?
We have, Andy, because a few episodes ago, Nick Randalls emailed us to tell us his story, and we've held back on reading his email until now when it was timely and poignant. But he had this to say, and I've edited this slightly for length because, like most of our emailers, Nick gave us an absolute tome, which was really fun to go through. But the Cliff Notes version for our listeners is: the first time I saw Hawkwind live was in 1981 on the Sonic Attack tour at Liverpool Empire. The band played in darkness for quite a bit of the gig, dwarfed by a massive sci-fi slideshow, The Astral Projections. I was blown away. Fired up by the gig, I decided to contact Dave and offer some of my artwork to the band. I think I hoped my pictures would get used in the Astral Projections. To my surprise, Dave wrote back and said he would have a look. I sent some fairly delicate watercolours inspired by the band's music and related weird stuff. Dave replied that they might use them in a tour programme. So I got on with my life until I bumped into a friend a few months later who had just bought a copy of the Church of Hawkwind album and happened to have it with him. He showed me the cover of the A4 lyric book included with the album. Mixed in with the strong black and white artwork of the excellent John Coulthart were my paintings, also in monochrome and looking a bit thin as they really needed to be in colour. Still, there it was, my artwork in a Hawkwind album, and one of my paintings had made it onto the back of the booklet in colour, along with inset photos from the Sonic Attack tour. Sadly, when I looked at the back cover, I saw that while Coulthart had his name credited, my work was credited to Tim. More correspondence with Dave followed, and I received an apologetic letter along with an autographed copy of the album. Mr. Brock said that he had given the record company my name and a result of the mix-up had fallen out with them, so maybe leaving RCA with the subsequent 80s wilderness years on Flickknife Records were all my fault. The boost to my confidence from getting something in print spurred me to apply for art college. Since then, I've spent my working life as a designer and illustrator, which is amazing. So we've been able to solve that and get that out there as the identity of Tim is not Tim, but is in fact Nick Randalls, who was good enough to share that story with us.
And he's also shared the original coloured watercolours that he did, that the band used in the booklet, but used them as black and white. And Nick actually says himself, he thinks they look a little thin for his taste in the booklet because they were intended to be colour. Well, we have the colour versions of all of Nick's work. So we'll put the original booklet, but at the end of the booklet, we will put the coloured watercolours, the illustrations that Nick has very kindly sent us, in an exclusive Hawkbinge full version with extras. And we will put links out for that just after we release this episode.
I think Nick makes a good point that they do look a lot better in colour. And I'm really glad that the one, which is I think my favourite of his, made it onto the back in colour, because that one I would imagine in black and white would just look like a mess.
Agreed.
But this idea of a strange, spooky, horned spirit is super cool.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I think the front and back cover, they are the strongest elements of this. The front cover, I think, of this booklet is absolutely stunning and should have been an album cover. And then that back cover would have been a fantastic back cover for the album that the big head would have been a front cover for. It's a beautiful full colour painting with the big moon and, as you say, this kind of pagan-y feeling image. And it's, you know, rather a nice thing. I'm guessing that it's not a tour program per se, because it doesn't really have the marks of a tour program with tour dates and band lineups and things like this all over it. It's been produced specifically as an insert for the album. Kind of a random but cool thing to do.
There's two things which I just want to pick up on this. In the lyrics, they actually have Virgin of the World in brackets, experiment with destiny, and they have the lyrics of the fires burn, the ashes spread, the lifted light, here's all that's said, we are undead, on the page. And yet in the album, that didn't actually happen. So it'd be interesting to know whether or not there was supposed to be a version of this which had those lyrics and were then removed, or whether or not they produced a booklet while they were producing the album and decided that's not what it was going to be on. But considering the album that Virgin of the World's on, I would have thought they'd have known that by now. But that was surprising to me.
Yes, that's a good point, and I can honestly say I have no idea.
The other thing is that on the front page of the booklet, it has the lives of great men all remind us we may make our lives sublime, which I thought were the words to a poem. Wasn't it like verse 13 or something of a poem?
Oh, yes. I can't remember who it was. There's been too much Hawkwind under the bridge, but it was a famous poem. Not quite famous enough for me to remember it, obviously, but there was a famous poem that those lines are taken from. Yeah.
Right, but on that lyric book, those lyrics are attributed to Dr. Technical. So I feel like Dave is doing some quite amazing plagiarism at the top of the, the book there.
You know what? I'm looking at that now. I'd never noticed that before. But yes, that's cheeky, to put it mildly. I have in my hands the double album reissue of this, which is rather nice, on heavyweight clear vinyl, where the booklet is actually used in the gatefold, basically, illustrations, and rather nicely.
Yeah, that is nice.
Rather nicely done, beautifully laid out. It's a really nice piece of work. It's a very good reissue. So what they haven't done with this double album reissue is do the thing where you end up with 4 sides that have like 2 tracks on each side, which winds me up every time I get one of those.
Yeah, it's more trips to the record player.
Yes, exactly. And the second album just has all of the original extras from the extended versions, which is a rather nice thing to have. So yeah, a really good, solid reissue that I'm glad that I have. So that is track by track, the cover art, the booklet, and the reissue. There's a lot to go on. Matt, sum up your feelings about Church of Hawkwind.
Church of Hawkwind for me is a 3-song album with a lot of extra packing material in it, which is fun for your ears, but eventually doesn't really germinate into anything super memorable. I think, as we've said, it is a interesting milestone in their development for their R&D. It's nice to hear them messing around and finding things that they like. And also, given the fact that there's so much bonus materials behind every album where you can hear different versions, you hear stories about the fact that Uncle Sam's on Mars was made because they were jamming over Opaloka live and you got new tracks. And so I feel like there's no reason why all of these songs don't exist. I do feel like in the current age that we're in of B-sides and extra CDs and extra content and all that kind of stuff, why this album wouldn't be essentially bolted onto another album as extra content and not necessarily an album in its own right. I feel like if it was released today, that's probably what would happen to it. I don't think it necessarily deserved to be an album by itself. I would have loved to have been like, sorry about the dry spell, here's an amazing album to really get our teeth into. And we've tried, but there's been several where we've just gone, yeah, it exists. And then you've gone, yeah, it exists. And then we moved on, you know. So we found some things to talk about. It's not bereft of interest for sure. But for me, I think there's really 3 tracks which have ever really caught and held my interest and made me really care or think about it. And then the rest of it has been so much like noodling. It's a solid, probably like 5 out of 10 kind of album for me. I don't think I'm going to pick it up on vinyl. I don't think I'll listen to it much beyond this. I might see whether or not there's a way of putting Some People Never Die into a playlist or two, because I do like the artiness of it in its slightly indecipherable, incomprehensible thing. There might be something else that I can get out of that if I listen to it for long enough. But that one major highlight is the peak of what is a very slim mountain in terms of real quality from a band that I know has done so much good stuff.
This probably is the album where you and I are the closest aligned. We've broadly seen eye to eye on pretty much every track. I probably liked The Church a little bit more than you did at a deeper level. But aside from that, I totally agree. There's very much 3 really solid tracks that would stand up to being on any album. But then a lot of other kind of just assorted experiments, which are fine if you listen to it, I think, with that intent. A bit like when you, as you kind of refer to really, you get a band's album of B-sides and rarities and, if you get a box set, there'll be an album in there of different versions of tracks and you'll play it once in a while because it has some curiosity value and they're kind of interesting. But it's not the one you're going to go back to and put on repeat and play a lot. And that's very much, I think, how I feel about this. The more I think about this as a piece of R&D, the stronger actually it gets, because putting it into that context makes it far more approachable for me, thinking about it that way. But yeah, I think we're of the same kind of mind. I do think it's good to count it as canon simply because I think that what they do here has an impact on what they do moving forward, and it's an interesting point of development for the band. But yeah, I suspect that this will go back to being an album that once every couple of years comes out because I've pretty much forgotten what's on it, and then it goes back again. I think that's probably where it will land for me as well. So, as we always do, we take our conclusion about this and we match it up as closely as we can to something approaching some kind of consensus. And Hawkwind fandom obviously is incredibly broad and far-reaching, and we found out, of course, on the Sonic Attack Deathmatch tournament that different Hawkwind communities in different places think different things. But we do have something that we use as our guide, which is the Hawkwind Fans Worldwide Facebook Top 40 Albums by the one and only Elric Newby, on which a particular Facebook group did vote on their favourite albums, which at least gives us some kind of list from which to compare our own thoughts. And interestingly, Church of Hawkwind is at number 23 on this list. Now, if we take out the live albums and the compilations from this list, I count that there are 6 between Church of Hawkwind and the number 1 album, Warrior on the Edge of Time, which would put this as a net 17. Now, I have been corrected on this before, but I put this at about 17. It is 1 behind Hawklords, 25 years on. But interestingly, it's 2 studio albums ahead of Sonic Attack, which definitely surprised me. I thought of Sonic Attack as being quite a big album in the band's history, and I remember being surprised that it was lower on the top 40 list when this book came out, as I think several other people were. But to find that Church of Hawkwind is actually ahead of it by several places, definitely a surprise for me. And in that kind of 16, 17 place, it's around halfway. It's always interesting, actually, those albums that end up kind of in the middle of the pack. I often wonder whether is that because lots of people put it in the middle when they were voting, or is it because half the people absolutely love it and the other half of the people absolutely hate it, so it ends up averaging out being in the middle? I kind of think it's more likely to be the former, where just a lot of people just end up thinking of it being there somewhere in the middle. But it's hard to say. All of which takes us to our selections, Matt, or more likely your selections, for the Hawkbinge Master and Sessions playlist. So first of all, what's going on the Master playlist from Church of Hawkwind?
It's got to be Some People Never Die. I think that will be an interesting one in the whole playlist, to hear the tracks which are much more like Hawkwindy. For this one to suddenly be a strange blip, I feel like this is the most arty, super strange blip to exist. There's some unresolved feeling around this which I need to get my head around, but the feeling that there is something in this beyond quite what I've got to yet is still nagging at me. So it's the one that definitely I'm left thinking about when the album is gone. If I'm thinking about any of them, it's this one. Solid choice. And of course, which one will join Some People Never Die in the Hawkbinge Sessions playlist? It's going to be Star Cannibal. I think it's a really just great, fun, groovy track, completely bonkers in places, completely indecipherable in others. However, there's such a analog charm to it that I do like it when it comes on. I do appreciate it as one of the fully formed thoughts that made it through on this album. I don't think it's as conceptually strong or as intriguing as Some People Never Die in order to make like the main playlist, but I think to include this into the other one, I think it's just like a solid groove that you can enjoy while it's there as you progress onto other tracks through the playlist.
Excellent. No, strong choice. I was quite happy to hear that it was Star Cannibal. Definitely that little riff stays with me long after I listen to that track. All of which brings us to the end of the Church of Hawkwind, and therefore the end of the Church of Hawkbinge. We are no longer in session. I've got to say, it's been excellent to be back podcasting again, hawk-binging again, and look forward to getting back onto this particular horse quite quickly. I think we're quite keen, having had Church of Hawkwind for the last 3 months, to put Choose Your Masks on the turntable and get into some air quotes new Hawkwind, particularly from where Matt's sitting anyway. And we will get that out there as soon as we can. And until then, bonjour, Matt.
Bonjour, Andy. You've been listening to Hawkbinge. It was devised and presented by Andy Hood and Matt Longstaff. The soundtrack was produced by Don Music Presents. To contact the show, drop us a message on Instagram, Facebook or Twitter by searching @Hawkbinge, or send an email to podcast@hawkbinge.space. Hawkbinge is part of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. To find more great band-focused podcasts like this one, head to @DeepDivePodNet on Twitter and dive in. Thank you as always for listening. We'll see you next time.
Was that all right? Was that a bit
I think it was okay.
Okay, cool.
I mean, if you want to redo it, you're welcome. But
okay, that'll do.
Yeah, don't start getting professional on me, Andy. I never know what you're doing.